So I was wondering if you could start by defining what polyamory means.
Sure. Well, to me, the way that I like to define it is it's kind of based off of this idea that love is unlimited. So, for example, when you have a new relationship with someone, whether that's a friendship or a more than a friendship, it doesn't take away from the other relationships that you have. You can always continue to grow on from there. So never ending. And also, so I've been reading a lot of books too and stuff like that. And one of the examples that they used to define it was if you have children and you have your first child and then you decide to have a second child, when you have your second child, it ideally does not take away any sort of love from your first child to be able to grow it from your second child. You can still love more than one person, maybe in a different way, sure, but it doesn't at all take away from that or devalue a relationship that you already have with someone. So yeah, love is unlimited. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I like that example of using kids because it hits the nail on the head, right? You can fully, completely, and wholly love more than one person in that same open, unconditional way.
Yeah, it's not like a limited supply.
Yeah.
Like, I only have this much, so I can only give it to this many people. It doesn't work that way. It's not a currency.
You just grow bigger. Yeah, that's awesome. So then how would you define the differences between polyamory and monogamy?
Sure. I mean, straight up definition wise, poly versus mono, so one versus many. And it's really just having a relationship with more than one person at the same time versus one-on-one, just that one time is more monogamous. And there's so many different, structures of polyamory because it's like an umbrella. So people think of like open relationship or like, threesomes or stuff like that, but it goes way more than that. So being able to be in a relationship with more than one person at the same time.
Okay. So that actually brings up a good question because that's a confusion that I have. So when people say they're in an open relationship, is that the same thing as saying that they're poly, or is there a distinction there?
I think there's definitely a distinction there. It is part of that umbrella for sure. And it's just so individualized because no relationship's the same as another, right? So you always build it based off of what works for both or all partners involved. So I feel like an open relationship means that it's non-exclusive, meaning that whether that's part of your sexual relationships or whether that's emotional and sexual, any part of those aspects can be within that open relationships, but I could see it a bit more casual versus polyamory. I connotate polyamory with more of the whole, so that's sexual, emotional, and the vulnerability that you have with someone, or it could be asexual relationship, whatever that is. There's depth in there because you invest your time and your love and your energy in that, versus maybe I'm in an open relationship, so I have my person, and then I maybe have my one-night stands with someone. Not saying that defines open relationship, but I think it's more casual in my personal definition versus a polyamorous relationship.
Yeah, so the distinction that you were making.
So non-exclusive versus like how non-exclusive you are, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course. So talking about polyamorous relationships, what would you say might be some of the biggest challenges that people have if they're in a polyamorous relationship?
Sure. Exposure, education.
What we're doing right now.
Yeah. And I think that, I came about this not knowing a thing. I had no exposure to it. I didn't feel ready to form an opinion about anything because I didn't know. So I thought to myself, let me do my due diligence and do my research and only make moves forward based on my interests, not interests of someone else or someone else and me. So I wanted to make sure it was because I wanted to do it, me solely, and that I want to practice things right. So ethical practices is very important because more than one person in a relationship all those people's or all those parties' feelings and consent are being considered.
Yeah.
So, like with a monogamous relationship, communication and honesty and all that is key, and it should be. The more people you have involved, the more consideration that goes around. So it's a lot. But the stigmas, I think, people think it just means that you can hook up as many times as you want, or you can cheat and you're allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not at all, I think, even close to what that's about. Because if consent and open communication is key in monogamy, like it's that times however many people are involved. So moving forward with things is a team effort, and it's about deepening your relationships with other people, because you can't put all your needs and wants on one person.
Yeah.
That's not fair for that person to have that responsibility. And so whether that's found through your other friends or other people in your life or other boyfriends or girlfriends or polygamy, which is involving marriage, I think it's more about that and not about the surface level, more sexual based kind of stigmas that it has. Mm-hmm. I think another important thing about it is it's a hidden community, and so this exposure and awareness with that education is really important now, so that we're not judged.
Yeah.
And just being able to feel open and vulnerable to talk about those things, because if you don't have a community to fall on with that, how are you going to move forward and become better, and how do you know when you're not practicing things ethically? Because you don't ever want to hurt anyone, and then you think you're doing it right. So, and just figuring out that there's so many different forms of it because people are pioneering it still today. So figuring out the different exercises and ways of those communication blocks and stuff and working those multiple relationships will come from building that community and building awareness.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned cheating, because I feel like that's one of the things that I hear when people don't really know what they're talking about when they talk about being poly. They say it's like it's just when cheating is allowed or something like that. So in that vein, like, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that exist about the polyamorous community?
I think just that with jealousy and with cheating, for example, that it's just dealt with. And that it's your excuse card to say that, no, I can because I'm polyamorous.
Yeah.
That's not at all how it should work, and that's not at all how it does work. And I think the tricky part about that is finding a partner or finding those answers within yourself. Is that really something you're okay with? Because if it's not, that's totally fine. But you don't move forward until everyone else is good. Yeah. And I've had those struggles too. And I think... I don't think the general public knows the depths that it can go into, because these are a lot of structures and philosophies that go past what we've kind of been drilled into with like Disney Cinderella princess kind of, the guy saves us, or you are the one that completes me and you're my only one.
The one soulmate.
And back on that idea I mentioned of like, you can't put all those responsibilities and needs and wants on one person. There's things that there are other structures out there that exist and that work for you, and that's the trick, is that finding what works for both you and the people involved. Religion does a big play in that as well, and so whether you are religious or you aren't, and whatever religion that you practice, that can still find a way to fit into that, but it's just so individualistic, so it's hard to just say it as a blanket answer.
Of course.
I think that's the main misconception, is that we're just able to cheat and just have sex anytime that we want, but that's nothing close to it at all.
Yeah. So how does the polyamorous community fit under the larger umbrella of the LGBTQIA community?
I feel like we have kind of a similar beginning. It wasn't, the LGBTQ community at first was not accepted, and it was definitely kept in the hush-hush. And it was hard to incorporate that in the public aspects of our life, like jobs, family, if we were religious. and we've come so far today in that, and I love being able to see how open and honest we can all be, and we don't have this fear anymore of being open. And so I feel like polyamory is on the cusp of that. We're finding that breakthrough right now. It was difficult for me to tap into those communities, especially in a very Bible Belt kind of southern area. But I think that we have that similar starting point. So we're kind of an underground, hush-hush community. People don't talk about it on the fly, but I found more of an openness to talk about it. And while I identify with the polyamorous community, but I don't think it's just you are, you aren't. It's a lifestyle choice, which is different, I feel, than the LGBT community, where it's something that you just are, and that's how your orientation is from the start. And then there is flexibility for finding those curiosities and figuring out what works for you as well. But I've also heard the other way too with polyamorous people, that they just felt like they've always been that way, and they couldn't understand why, or they felt like it was wrong, and that it was going against like all the different structures and stuff in their life of how society told them to live their lives and do the relationship kind of timeline. So I feel like there's a lot of those similarities, and reading and being exposed to polyamorous friends or people in the LGBT community, they've told me that a lot of polyamory is a lot more open in that community, because they're already so vulnerable to each other, and they have this tight-knit group built. And so I feel like in the straight community, it's not as accepted, let alone as a popular choice.
We're not having the conversations like this.
No.
Yeah.
No, this is definitely my first kind of conversation like this. So there's that. But I think that's how they already have like that chip off their shoulder, both of those communities.
And they're already open, they're already communicating, so it's almost natural that it comes up organically.
Yeah. So we're both trying to create our platform and trying to create a voice, and that letting the world know that this is a thing and it's okay, and we're here. So.
And what you said about having similar starts, hopefully that's something that works out in the long run too. I mean, thankfully the LGBT community has much more mainstream acceptance now than they've had in the past.
Yep.
So hopefully that's something that's similar that happens for the polyamorous community. They have way more exposure and way more acceptance. The stigma disappears.
When people are more aware of it, and educated on it, that there's nothing to be scared of about it. It's just a thing that works better for some people.
Yeah. So talking about the LGBTQ community, as intersectional feminists, I'm interested to know, how can we really work to better ally ourselves with this community?
With the polyamorous community? Or
with the LGBTQ community.
Right. So understanding each other, I think patience is key. I think a little more effort can be done on all sides. It's hard when you're brought up in circles of people that aren't exposed to that. So, how else are you going to have that opportunity, that window to learn, and let alone have a safe place to learn and be exposed?
And ask questions.
Yes. Yeah. So I think if I ever find an opportunity, whatever side I'm on, whether I'm the learnee or the learner, I don't know if that's a word. Anyways, but if someone uses like a racial slur against me, for example, I get very riled up and I get really passionate about it, and I want to fire back in their face all the time. What I've been working on for a long time is redirecting that energy towards correction and education. So instead of being like firing back at them and calling them another name, just being like, you're being racist right now, or that is not a correct term for you to use, and I don't appreciate that. Patience, education, and I think when it comes to representation, like especially in the arts, as an actor, I've tried to find a platform for that, to give more opportunities for certain demographics that maybe don't have that opportunity, specifically Asian Americans, in acting, for example, theater or film. So I think that if you have a platform, if you have that kind of power and that status, bring awareness to it. That's a power that you have, and why not yield it towards good? Why not yield it towards other people or communities that could use that more? So I think the same could be applied to this sort of situation.
Yeah. And as allies and as people with different identities that are connected to different communities, we have so much more exposure, so much more pull that we could be engaging with and helping to get involved as we support, members of the LGBT community.
And I think another important point about being involved is that it's not always about being right, and it's not always about success. I've learned that there's a huge amount of humbleness that's necessary. So I'm not afraid to say, you're right, I really messed up on that. Or, you know what, that's not something I should be saying anymore. And when it's brought to my awareness or approached to me, I know a lot of people don't take confrontation very well, so that's also difficult. But if someone points out to me in a polite manner, like, hey, when you say this makes me feel this way and I don't think it's appropriate, or it does hurt this person's feelings, and it takes courage for me to say, I'm sorry, you're right, thank you for telling me about that. I'm going to make sure I try and work on that from now on. And I see people's reaction in those situations not go so well.
Yeah.
So when they feel attacked, or whether it's done well in that confrontation, when they are just being brought down and being like, hey, this is a thing that you're doing and it's actually coming off this way. Unfortunately, I see a lot of people get upset over it because it's this denial and this kind of shame of like, oh, no, I couldn't make that mistake, or, how embarrassing. So then they take it as a fire back opportunity as opposed to like accepting and being like, how can I move forward together with this person to do better?
They're automatically defensive instead of reflective.
So I think that's key.
I mean, you've touched on a lot of really key points. I feel like, as a person of color, there's so many ways in which like my lived experience is very different from other folks.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine that, if you're a person in the LGBT community and you're a person of color or a minority in some other way, that your experiences are going to be radically different than your white peers, right? Yeah. And I think it's so key that we understand that and we acknowledge that in helping us to be better allies.
Yeah, and like as a identifying ally, I may not have enough of those shared experiences, but I've seen it and I've been there. And so if that's my close exposure to that, I hope that I can empower and encourage my friends and loved ones of the LGBT community or allies to be up there with them and to support, because it's hard, especially with this whole political climate and stuff like that.
Yeah.
People are more quick to act versus work together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As an intersectional feminist or someone who's trying to be intersectional in her activism, I find that sometimes the hardest work that I do, especially as an ally for the LGBT community, is really kind of engaging with my Asian American identity and working within the Asian culture, and specifically like working with my family. As a younger person, myself and my friends, we all have exposure, tons of exposure.
Right.
We understand this, we know it, we have friends with these identities, and we're all natural allies. But I think it's like a harder conversation to have when I'm talking with my parents or, or their friends, people their age who just don't have that exposure, both culturally but also just generationally.
Yep.
And so I find that some of the hardest work I do as an intersectional ally is really kind of reaching back and having these difficult conversations at home, and starting and practicing my allyship at home with my mom and dad first, before being able to take it out and help other people also become better allies.
I totally feel you and understand that. It's tough because we have such a traditionally rich culture, the Asian culture, and with that, it's hard to let it be flexible and let it grow into a flexible position with an older generation, such as our parents. There's that saying or excuse all the time, they're set in their ways. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, blah, blah, which I hate. But I mean, I think what I try and focus on is the core value of we are people, we are all valuable and need to be respected regardless of our background, regardless of our lifestyles. And, whether or not religion is a conflict in that, I think it's always taught to always love thy neighbor as yourself, that kind of thing. You know, I don't see why, unless what you're doing is hurting someone, that it should be an issue, and as long as it's consensual, obviously. But I haven't had as much struggle, luckily, in my family set with those kind of talks or situations, but I've seen it, and I think pulling and redirecting that focus towards kindness and towards acceptance, because we all have that thing. We all have maybe an identifier that's not the norm, an identifier that's not the typical conventional white American sense, right? Whether that's being Asian American, whether that's being part of the LGBT community, and I don't like that negative connotation. Why does that have to be a chip off of our shoulder? That's something that enriches us. That's something that gives us even more depth to ourselves. Not something that should bring us down, especially in the economic or professional setting. So I think just focusing on that we are all people.
Yeah, and as immigrants and as people of color, we were also once the outsider, and in some ways we still are, right? And so being able to kind of find that kind of empathy and being able to recognize that in this community, that oftentimes people don't understand them because they're cast as the outsider.
Yep.
And if we can empathize with that, that's a great way to open the door and bring entire immigrant communities in to say, like, the fight for these rights is the same as us fighting for our communities.
We all have a struggle,
Yeah.
regardless of what it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, even if you are a white American, we all have our struggles. Yeah. So, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about, talking about like generational changes, what do you think about how our culture's like mainstream acceptance of LGBTQ identities? How has that changed in the past couple of years? Any differences that you've noticed, or not even just the past couple of years, but the past couple of decades?
Sure.
We're talking about what it was like for our parents and what it's like now for us.
Yeah. I mean, huge differences is the stimulus, right? So we're constantly available to information. We're constantly available to media with our smartphones, with technology and computers and stuff. So travel and geographically, we're a lot more interconnected. It's not as hard to be able to see what's going on in another country as it was before. So those changes have helped us realize that we're all the same kind of person in a way. I think also because we're all being born in that sort of time where it's normal. Everyone's been able to have some exposure to it now. People are now becoming more open about it because they can, because we've created these safe spaces for it, as opposed to a long time ago, which is great. And I really do hope that it keeps continuing on to where it's just like, oh, okay, you're part of that? Cool. What else? It's not even a thing that we have to think about anymore.
It's so common that it's not like a separate identifier. It's not an outsider moment. It's just something different. Yeah. Well, I kind of wanted to wrap up and ask a more direct question of, like, as allies, how can we really show up and stand up for our friends and our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community? It's really easy to be an ally and to be supportive when they're our friends and when we're with them.
Yes.
But I think the challenge really arises when we're in situations, whether our friends are there or not, when people aren't supportive. They're not supportive of these identities, they're not supportive of these communities, and they're not trying to be inclusive. And so in those situations where there is a lot of misunderstanding or tension, how can we as allies kind of explicitly show our support and explicitly stand up for our friends?
Absolutely. It's tough because you can't make someone do something they're not comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. But I hope that growing this safe environment will help people become more vulnerable and safe to do so, to act upon these things. I think that if you're silent when it happens, it's not helping anyone, especially when the person in need is right next to you physically. So I think it's important to, if you see something, say something, that kind of saying, but in a different context. If you see something, say something. That doesn't mean you have to be ugly about it. Mm-hmm. That just means standing up for your friend, not only letting your friend or supporter or loved one know that you were there, but also acknowledging the fact and putting it out publicly, like, hey, this is a red flag. It's not okay.
This is unacceptable.
Not okay for this person or me. I think it's also important to, however way you are comfortable being involved politically, and making those choices to be heard.
Yeah.
So
That's fantastic. Thank you.
absolutely, thank you.
Perfect timing, guys.
Perfect
Perfect timing.
See you windmill.
Yeah.